So on the last one, as my camera decided to die on me, I was telling you guys it was about John Colter. And John Colter was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition who was given permission to go with these two other guys to discontinue the Lewis and Clark, but head back up the Missouri River. And I wish I don't know what got on that last tape, but he ventured into this amazing area where, you come in, there's like the Grand Canyon kind of situation with a huge waterfall. And then he saw petrified trees, that some of them standing up. And he saw all these hydrothermal kind of components, sometimes just muddy pots that blowing their bubbles and stuff like that, sometimes super clear but superheated water, and in the most spectacular, sometimes the water just gushing out of the earth. In one case, doing it very high and doing it at a very regular kind of rhythm. And then there's a huge, big lake in this area. And when he went back to tell the people what he'd seen, of course, some of them thought that he was crazy, but what he had seen, of course, was the area of the Yellowstone. John Colter was the first American ever to venture into the realm of the Yellowstone. I do appreciate the fact that the Americans will fairly quickly realize the importance of this, and they will designate it as a special area. It becomes really not the first national park, not just the first national park of the United States, but really the first national park of the world. I will tell you that they didn't really know what they were doing. It will take them some time, and not till the latter part of the 19th century when John Muir and others come in to really kind of push what we call the preservationist credo, will they begin to really protect it. But still early recognition of just the amazing nature of this particular area. So Colter had that interesting experience. Now, what John Colter was he was a fur trapper. And what John Colter will ultimately represent is the second of the great frontiers I want to tell you guys about. The first was the government frontier, the primary manifestations, of course, the Louisiana Purchase and the activities of Lewis and Clark and others. The second major frontier that will have a big impact, I'm going to call it the fur trade frontier. The fur trade frontier. Now, the fur trade frontier was it's one of the cutting edge of the frontier kind of activities. There were these individuals, and they are called sometimes the mountain men, and sometimes they were called fur trappers, and the French called them the coureurs de bois. And they were always kind of on the very edge of the non-Native American experience in the West. And what they were doing primarily was they were looking for beaver. And the reason they were looking for beaver was because for about 300 years, Europeans and their associates wore hats. And almost all of those hats were made from beaver pelts. Beaver pelts were critically important. And the hat, wearing of the hats was about a 300-year long period. Not everyone wore hats all the time, but it was a time of men wearing hats. And the hat styles would change over time. So I'm thinking of the kind of the Puritan hat where you have the kind of broad brim and the very high crown. And of course, you never wanted your crown to go to a point because that's a witch's hat. You wanted to be squared off, of course. And then during the Revolution, the tricorn or the tricorner hat, where you've got a round hat, round brim, and then you just fold it up on two sides, and then the other side, of course. Then later on, the stovepipe, or I like to call it the Mad Hatters. The stovepipe is moving on just a little bit farther. The Mad Hatter style hat. I swear, when you look at England in the early part, the Jane Austen kind of period, all these guys are wearing a variety of hats of something like that. No matter what the style was, they're all made out of beaver pelts. How that happened exactly, I tried to read up a little bit on it. I don't know exactly what they were doing there, but somehow able to either shape the leather or the pelts into a felt, which they could then shape into a hat. And it was the rage. I mean, all the good hats were made out of beaver skin, and even today, some of the highest quality cowboy hats are actually made out of beaver pelts. But what happened was, they just continued to hunt the beaver till the beaver were on the verge of extinction. Right about the end of the 1830s, 1840, you were looking. I mean, no matter what, it's going to have to change, right? Because the beaver are going to be gone. And luckily, the fashions changed just enough so that there are at least some remnant beaver who will continue to survive. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen beaver, but they are really cool. I've seen them twice in the Sierras. The most fun was we were camped in an area that was right next to a beaver pond, and it's kind of amazing. I mean, they make that dam, and they made this big dam in this area. There's a creek coming down into the river, and the water, of course, forms in a big kind of lake behind it, and it does kill trees and things like that, And they bring the trees down. But I was on a down tree in the middle of that beaver pond in the twilight, so it was getting dark, and you're in the forest, and the trees are kind of cutting light anyway. And I saw this beaver just swimming along the surface and look almost like a submarine just below the water, and the water is crusting over the brow. You can just see this little ripple effect. And it was across the pond, and then it turned and it swam directly underneath me. I just stood stock still, and it just went underneath me. And, you know, I actually was fairly big, you know, from nose to tail, basically. And I got to tell you, you know, at that moment, I went from being, oh, this is a wonderful, you know, a little bit scared. I thought, oh my God, they've got big, powerful teeth. What if it tried to take a chomp out of my leg or something like that? But, you know, the beaver, of course, you know, hunted almost to the brink of extinction, will make a comeback, and they're doing relatively well in the mountains areas, in different areas of the United States. Anyway, the beaver were the primary objective of the fur trappers, and because, you know, they start to hunt them out in certain areas of the United States, you have to keep moving. First place they did, I think I told you guys, you know, in the early colonial period, they hunted the beaver out of the Great Lakes area, so that meant that you got to go farther afield. And in the end, they're going to come all the way to California, even Baja California, the mountains of Baja California, to look for the beaver. Now, this frontier was the frontier of you know, the rugged individual par excellence. You got these individuals who are on at the fringe of this, you know, you know. By the way, this was big money. I forgot to tell you that John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company was you know, was a big company in America. He was the richest man in America with his personal fortune of $20 million in 1820. A lot of money to be made, and sometimes the fur trappers would come back with a catch that was as much as like $25,000. Big money in terms of the beaver pelts. But these guys were these extraordinary kind of rugged individualists that were on the fringe, of course, of just any kind of American human activity, and of course in the realm of the Native Americans in the natural world, routinely, you know, hundreds of miles, 500,000 miles away from America, from civilization, in a kind of way, against the elements, you know, against nature in some way, against, of course, Native Americans, you know, challenging and routinely kind of a short life expectancy for these individuals. But, you know, they became famous in their own way. Here's some mountain, so we call them the mountain men routinely, of course, and I'll just mention a few of them. Manuel Lisa, half French and half Spanish, and according to legend, half alligator and half fox. I have no idea what that would look like. And one of the first big money makers out of St. Louis in terms of the fur trade. Mike Fink is his name became famous, not so much for you guys, but in my generation when I was a kid, because Disney turned him into kind of one of their cartoon heroes. Mike Fink, I'm Mike Fink, king of the river. I had his own little song and everything like that. But just want to tell you how Mike Fink died, because it kind of is an indication of the rough life of these mountain men. But apparently he died playing sort of a mountain man roulette. So they were sitting around a campfire, and they're drinking, and they would put little objects on their heads, and then the contest was to shoot the object off the other guy's head. So it's Mike Fink's turn, and the guy across from him has some object on his head. And Mike Fink was known for being a marksman. If you ever have seen kind of the Disney versions of Mike Fink, I remember there's a contest where he puts a bullet off a frying pan, hits this, you know, and it hits the target after ricocheting around the area. Anyway, he was apparently a little unhappy with the guy that he was shooting at, and so he shot just a little bit low, and just enough to graze the guy's scalp. So he hits the object, but he also grazes the guy's scalp, and of course you can imagine everybody there knew that he'd done that on purpose. Well, the next guy whose turn it is, you know, he's going to shoot something off of Mike Fink's head, and he's deciding to do a little payback as far as Mike Fink was concerned. And he either wasn't a good shot, or he, you know, I don't know, maybe inebriated or something like that. But his bullet actually went right into the head of Mike Fink, and thus ending the exciting, interesting life of Mike Fink. He was a mountain man primarily, but he also did the riverboat thing that the Disney kind of focused on. And finally, Jim Bridger, and there's a bunch of these guys. I don't want you to think this is the entire crew or anything like that. Jim Bridger is one of the few of these mountain men who actually lived to old age. They routinely don't live that long. I think he lived actually into his 70s. Totally illiterate, but his mind was an atlas of the West, and he could take you just about any place you would want to go. One of his interesting moments was that he came upon the Great Salt Lake. So he's coming out of the mountains of Utah, and he sees this huge body of water, and, you know, he either took a sip of it or something, you know, smelled it, you know, and it's salt water, and, you know, for a moment there he was really confused. He thought, oh my God, is this the Pacific Ocean? Of course, there was no way that could have been the situation, but, you know, these guys, you know, just had this extraordinary moment of kind of exploring across the West. Of all the mountain men, though, there's the kind of the great example of it, the archetype, and the individual who will represent the mountain man and the fur trade frontier for us, of course, is this man by the name of Jedediah Smith, and Jedediah Smith will become our potential identifications. Jedediah Smith was born in 1799, so right at the turn of the century, and he will die in 1831 under circumstances that I'm about to tell you in just a little bit here. Smith became sort of the archetype of the mountain man, just an amazing career of travel across the American West, from Mexico in the south to Canada in the north to the Pacific Ocean in the west. He goes everywhere. And it's intriguing to me, he has a pretty plain name. His name was Smith. But there's a lot of places in the West that have, Smith this or Smith that, and you think it could be anybody, right? But it's probably not. It's probably Jedediah, because Jedediah just becomes this kind of, extraordinary, explorer extraordinary. In about 1820 or so, a young man, he decided to go out to the West. He got himself a job with a fur trading company out of St. Louis. And I often wonder, was his job primarily to trap furs or just to look for locations? And it may have been something more like that, because he just really does have this extraordinary wanderlust and goes all over the place. Now, I always like to think of Jedediah Smith as the first American to go here, the first American to go there. So I do want to kind of highlight, though, that I did one of these. Goes to the mountains in 1820, okay? Anyway, here's one of his really important discoveries, if you will. And I'm going to describe this as he is the discoverer of the Great South Pass in 1822, the Great South Pass. Now, the reason this is so important is because it becomes the essential way west. I mean, how do you get from the eastern part of the United States to the west coast ultimately? It's not exactly the easiest road to hoe. You've got the entire Rocky Mountain Cordillera, you've got the tremendous deserts, of course, in the south, all kinds of difficulties that would kind of be in your way of doing that. And what Jedediah Smith was, he found the best way west. Now, it's called the Great South Pass. I'm going to point my finger to it. I know that it's a little distance for you guys from the map. But it's actually up in Wyoming. It's kind of in the central southern part of Wyoming. And of course you would say that doesn't seem very far south, but it's just a relative southness. It's south of where Lewis and Clark were. They were up here, and this is where Jedediah Smith is down here. We do believe that Jedediah Smith was not the first European, first non-Native American to see this place. And there might have been an English explorer, and we think that he may have been coming from the west, and he found kind of the same location. But it's a classic kind of Vespuccian thing. He didn't understand, he didn't articulate. And so it's only Jedediah Smith who really begins to realize what's going on here. I had the opportunity, I flew from Ontario Airport to Salt Lake City and then to Rapid City, South Dakota. And that second leg took us right over the South Pass area. And it was just, so wonderful to kind of really get to see it from the plains view. And it just shows you right there what's exactly going on there. To the north, there were all of the Rocky Mountains activities that you're heading up into Idaho and stuff like that. Of course, I couldn't see it. I was on the north side of the plain, but I knew that the Colorado Rockies were to the south. But you have this section that's just kind of a broad, open area. Now, it's high in elevation. It's about 8,000 feet high, so you're up there. It is the Continental Divide, that backbone situation where, the rivers are going to either go to the east or going to go to the west from that point on. So you're high in altitude, but it's a big monster alluvium. It's not mountaintops. It's not mountain passes. It's a huge alluvium. And it was Jedediah Smith who was the first to kind of see that this is the way to go. If you're going to go to the especially the Pacific Coast, this is the way that you should go. And he will make it, of course, the primary route. Ultimately, it will become known to us as the Oregon Trail, for those who would go to Oregon. It will become known to us as the California Trail, for those who would go to California. It is generically known as the Immigrant Trail. And we estimate that somewhere around 375,000 people, Americans, will cross this area. It was the way west, where the wagons would go through. And when they finally built a railroad, that's the way they're going to go. And when they finally built the first transcontinental highway in the area, that's the way it's going to go, of course. That's where Interstate 80 goes. And that's just the best way to go, basically. I do want you to know that if you are both on the railroad and on the highway, you're to the south of the Great South Pass. So they find another kind of way that they would go through. But it's all generally through this particular area. I've driven through there multiple times. And of course, it's obvious. If you've ever done Interstate 70 through the Colorado Rockies, you realize how difficult that is. And 80 is quite different. There's some things you got to climb, whatever. But it's not going to have that same kind of, you're just heading up a super high mountain or something, like having to go through a pass. So this was the essential way, and he's the founder of the Great South Pass, which becomes a critical part of the American story. Now, because he went through this area, it kind of opened the door to the west for him. And he will, among other things, begin to go into the area of Oregon. So we could say he was the first American into Oregon, which creates the foundation for the Oregon Trail. Now, I do want you to know that he never got to the Pacific Coast. He gets into Oregon, but he doesn't venture all the way. So that he doesn't quite finish that off. It also meant that he would explore into the areas, of course, of the Great Basin, including the area of Utah. But here's, the story that I always like to talk about, and he becomes, identification for California history because of this. He explored through the area generally of Utah. He got down and he found what we would call the Virgin River. So he followed the Virgin River down towards the Colorado. I don't know if you guys know anything about the Virgin River, but that's the route of Interstate 15 as you're going north out of Las Vegas on your way to Salt Lake. So you go through the Virgin River Gorge and kind of on your way up to St. George. So if you go up on, if you've been on that road, then you know what it was that Jedediah Smith was coming down. And he came down on the Virgin River and he gets to the Colorado River. So he gets all the way to right here, which of course is on the boundary of California. And I have to tell you that he had to make his decision, I'm not going to go back, I'm going to go forward. And, it was in November, I think, November of 1826, and his decision was to go forward, instead of going back. So he will become the first American ever to venture into the realm of California generally, and only the second American ever to venture all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. The first group, of course, is Lewis and Clark and Jedediah Smith with his group. They are the second group. And they came in, they went across the Mojave Desert. They passed through Cajon Pass, if this sounds familiar to guys. They came down into what you and I would call the San Bernardino Valley. They took a pretty hard right as they're going into the Pomona Valley on their way ultimately to the San Gabriel Valley, and they arrived at Mission San Gabriel in November of 1826. It's the first Americans ever to cross overland into what would become the state of California. Now, not only do we have Jedediah Smith's record from this, but we have documentation from the missions themselves. So, and of course, it was stunning for the Padres there at Mission San Gabriel, for the Californios. These Americans had come overland, which and there was a real kind of concern with this. Like, oh my God, are you guys Americans coming across? And of course, probably the next American you're going to find is like 1,000+ miles to the east. So that wasn't necessarily happening. But I do want to say this one thing. We have documentation from the Mission San Gabriel, so the padre there will say that this happened. But the thing that he said that was just so intriguing was that he described Jedediah Smith as a hideous-looking man. And you guys all know that that doesn't seem like a very kind thing, but the reality is that Jedediah Smith was a hideous-looking man, at least as far as his facial figure was concerned. Now, I do need you to know that he was not born that way. This is not his fault in any kind of way. But it was the result of the fact that he had run into the scourge of the mountain man, just, one of the most dangerous things that a mountain man could run into. And the story is that he was, placing a trap, and, when they place these beaver traps, they put this kind of really super strong, smelly stuff that was an attractant to the beaver. But you can imagine this would attract other animals too. So, the vision of this is that while he's setting the trap, behind him comes a grizzly bear. The grizzly bear, extraordinarily powerful, extraordinarily dangerous, of course, in terms of, human beings in this area. And it may have been that the grizzly bear attacked him from behind. And one thing that happens, and you guys know the grizzly bears have claws that are about the same length as my fingers, these really big claws. And we think that maybe the grizzly bear came down upon his head, which makes sense if you're kind of coming down on the person, and kind of scalping him and taking away part of the side of his face. Jedediah Smith would also have broken ribs. That became part of the story too. He probably passed out, and that may have been a good thing, because the grizzly bear wasn't interested in him. He was interested in whatever was creating the smell. But later, Dr. Hine tells us that Jedediah Smith would have to get onto a horse. He's going to have to ride like 60 miles or something like that to get to an encampment. And there, the guys there tried to help him, and they took a needle and thread and they pulled his face back together and they sewed it the best they possibly could. But I'm sure you can imagine these are not cosmetic surgery, and whatever the end result is not going to be, anything that looks very attractive. So I do think it was appropriate to say that he was described as a hideous-looking man. I saw, there's some sort of, I don't know what it is, like little painting kind of things of Jedediah Smith, and apparently he wore his hair kind of in an interesting way, and it may have been like a, little Phantom the Opera effort to kind of cover that, the side of it, the scarred up part of his face, but anyway, he's going to live with those scars for the rest of his life. I guess the bad news is he's scarred. The good news is he doesn't live very much longer. That seems like a harsh thing to say. But anyway, Jedediah Smith was indeed kind of, scarred by this. But he comes into Mission San Gabriel. The Padres there basically said, you better check in with the authorities. And at that time, the governor of California, the Mexican governor of California, I think his name was Michelinda, he was located down in San Diego. So that meant that Jedediah Smith would go down from the LA basin area down to San Diego. And what that means is, and this always works so much better when I'm standing in my classroom, that if you travel from Escondido to Oceanside, you're going to cross the path of Jedediah Smith. I mean, this guy goes just about everywhere. And of course, when I'm in my classroom, I always say, rumor has it that he passed right where we are standing right now. Of course, lower down, we're on the 3rd floor. But anyway, of course, there's no truth to that necessarily. But you know, who knows? He may have. He goes all over the place. Now, in San Diego, the governor was polite, but also sort of, you know, not very happy about the situation. And he told Jedediah that, you know, Smith and crew, you guys have got to go. You know, you've got to get the heck out of here, okay? So, you know, he basically said you need to leave California. What I love about that moment is that that meant that Jedediah Smith was probably the first person who ever would determine what exactly California is. The Mexicans lived primarily, the Californians lived in the coastal strip all the way from actually Sonoma, of course, in the north, all the way down to San Diego. And they did not live much into the interior whatsoever. And so Jedediah Smith essentially just makes a decision that means that California is just the coastal strip. This is where they're living. So he goes back north to the Los Angeles area. He then heads north out of Los Angeles, not to the east, and he goes ultimately through the Tehachapi Mountains through to Home Pass, and he became the first American ever to venture into the Central Valley of California. So he's going to be the first person to go all these particular places. He then, of course, will go into the Sierra Nevada because he saw that as the potential of the rich area for beaver, and there's truth in that, no doubt about that. He also then became the first American ever to cross the Sierra Nevada. We do not know where he did this. It was probably more in the southern area, and that's the real high Sierra. So I have a feeling of the, you know, picture of them, you know, kind of going through some of those really high alpine passes you find in the high Sierra area. Anyway, you know, so this is his first trip to California. He will return ultimately in 1828, so a couple years later from the beginning point. This time, a really rough trip. They came in through the Mojave area. They run into the Mojave Indians. They're attacked. A portion of his crew is killed by the Native Americans. So kind of from the very beginning, it's very problematic. They go up into the Central Valley, into the foothills of the Sierras, and they're going to do their trapping there. But for some reason, you know, they get themselves in difficulty. They run out of food. And so Smith decides he's going to go to Monterey. Monterey would have been kind of a base of operations for the northern part of California, for the Californios. And when he arrives there, he gets thrown in jail. You know, they basically had told him to leave, and here he is still there. Luckily, there was an American captain there, probably involved in the hide and tallow trade, and the captain is able to bail Smith out, of course, pay the monies for that. And Smith is basically told to leave and never return. And you know, it'll work out that way one way or the other. But he's not done really with California. As he left out of Monterey, instead of going, of course, east, he went north through the Sacramento Valley. He passed back over to the north coast. So, you know, all these parts of California that simply are, you know, it's Jedediah Smith who's the first to see this. But I always like to remark upon this because as he ventured back into the coast of California, the north coast of California, he will venture into the realm of the tallest living things on the face of the planet. And I can only imagine what it would have been, of course, at that time to venture into the old groves of the redwoods, of the coastal redwoods. I don't know if you guys know these things or you've seen them before, but of course they're magnificent. The tallest are 370 feet plus, you know, if they fall down. That is a football field in both end zones, of course, and even a little bit more than that in terms of their relative height. Just amazing trees, of course, you know. So he was the first to see that, and just as a suggestion that that's the situation, a river up there is called the Smith River, and a very, very fine state park located in the area for camping and having fun is Jedediah Smith State Park. So if you ever get a chance, make sure you check that out. I camped up there. I did some mountain biking up in that area. Really fun to just be riding your mountain bike through the redwoods. When I was up there, though, there were signs all over that there were mountain lion sightings, and so I'm riding the entire time just, oh no, is there going to be, you know, I'm going to get jumped by a mountain lion. As you can probably guess, I did not. Anyway, you know, Jedediah Smith will be the first American to ever venture into the realm of the redwoods, and this is, you know, actually the end of his California experience. I'll at least say that. Just a little word on the redwoods. When the Americans came and saw the redwoods, of course, they thought that was a lumberman's dream, right? You got all of that wood. And, you know, it wasn't the coastal redwoods, just the coastal. It was also the giant sequoia, which are not as tall, but just so much more bulk. And, of course, the thought was that all that bulk equals all that wood. But when they chopped down those giants, I mean, there's just too much weight there that they'd crash. They would destroy themselves upon impact. And it's estimated that like 80% of the big trees that knock down are just total waste. You know, what a sad thing, thinking that there's going to be some huge benefit from cutting down redwoods, when in the end, of course, you're really just destroying the wood in so many ways. And smaller redwoods would have always been the better way to go, the giants and all. And, you know, you go up into some of the basins up in the Sierra Nevada, and they've destroyed over 80% of the trees were just knocked down, and many of them, of course, nothing really coming of that. Now I'm just going to finish Jedediah Smith with you guys. He went all the way up to the Columbia River. This was the location of a British trading area called Fort Vancouver. And they kept on having difficulty. And by the time they get there, there's only like 2 guys that were left out of the original crew. I think it was 18 in the beginning, of course, serious attrition. They made their way back, and they're going to go to the